Hello learners, welcome to the 25th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. In the past few lectures, we have undertaken a detailed study of the life and the work of the American poet Edna St. Vincent Millay. I have described how Millay uses the traditional forms of poetry to write works that were both increasingly popular as well as incredibly complex. I spent some time in the previous lecture describing the form, the literary historical tradition of the sonnet, and how Edna St. Vincent Millay falls back on not only this particular form, which is very old and very strict, but also within this form, the more conservative, the older version of the sonnet, which is the Petrarchan sonnet, as opposed to the Shakespearean sonnet, in order to convey works and worlds of great power. I will conclude our discussion of this poet by providing a detailed reading and analysis of one sonnet. This sonnet is important because it is perhaps the single most well-known, well-read, and widely studied poem by this writer. If people have heard of Edna St. Vincent Millay and have read only one poem by her, it is most likely to be this poem. The poem is a sonnet from the collection The Harp-Weaver and Other Poems, which I mentioned earlier was the collection that established Millay's reputation in the American public culture. For this collection of poems, Millay won the Pulitzer Prize in the year 1923, and by doing so became the first woman writer to win the prize. This award established Millay as a household name. I also mentioned that this represents in some ways a peak in the complexity and the brilliance of the poet, and to some extent we can also see that the subsequent writing that Millay undertook could not really match the quality, the complexity, and the dexterity of the poems in this volume. Given that this volume itself was of such unique technical brilliance, the stakes are even high when I say that this poem is the one that allows us to witness the brilliance and the greatness of the poet. So what is it about this poem which makes it so well known and so well worth studying? Let us now find out by reading each word of this sonnet. I, being born a woman and distressed by all the needs and notions of my kind, am urged by your propinquity to find your person fair, and feel a certain zest to bear your body's weight upon my breast. So subtly is the fume of life designed to clarify the pulse and cloud the mind, and leave me once again undone, possessed. Think not for this, however, the poor treason of my stout blood against my staggering brain. I shall remember you with love, or season my scorn with pity. Let me make it plain, I find this frenzy insufficient reason for conversation when we meet again. Now I will begin by tracing the rhyme scheme of these lines, and which will be a clue to helping us understand what kind of a sonnet it might be. I will read out the last words of each line, and that way we can understand what kind of a sonnet this is. So there's distressed, kind, find, zest. This is A, B, B, A. And then there is breast, designed, mind, possessed. This is B, C, C, B. It just so happens that possessed and zest rhyme, which means that the first set of rhymes in each quatrain, that is each set of 4 lines, happens to be the same sound. They do not have to be. So we see that the first 8 lines are following a Petrarchan rhyme scheme. Let us now see what happens in the remaining 6 lines. Treason, brain, season, plain, reason again. So we see a very clear pattern again. This is D, E, D, E, D, E. Right? Now, the clear division of this 14-line poem is between an octave and a sestet. That is 8 and 6, which reminds us or which gives us a hint that it is most likely a Petrarchan sonnet. To recall briefly, the Shakespearean sonnet is split into 3 quatrains and a couplet. Right? Here we have 2 sets of lines, one 8 and one 6. Now, if this is truly a Petrarchan sonnet, there is one other very important condition that must be met. And that condition is that there is a change, a twist in the tale, as it were, a change in the progression of ideas, which happens roughly around the midpoint. That is to say, the change in the ideas happens around line 9. That is, the first line of the sestet, which is line 9. Now, to be able to verify where that change in the progression of ideas occurs and how important a shift it is to qualify as a twist in the tale, we must track the inquiry, the progression of ideas, how these ideas are presented, what is the poet asking, and how the poet is going about asking that question by looking at the words from the very beginning of this poem. So the poet begins by saying something very dramatic, referring to her identity. The poet says, "I, being born a woman, and distressed by all the needs and notions of my kind, am urged by your propinquity to find your person fair and feel a certain zest." Right? So the poet says that something is happening, and the reason for that is because I was born a certain way. Being born a certain way means that the poet is saying this is a matter in which she doesn't have a choice. Nobody asked her what to do. Because things happened before she had the capacity to choose. And nobody has the capacity to make this choice, whether or not they will be born. Right? So when the poet says, "I, being born a woman," is saying that I am doing certain things because I have to, because it is my destiny, because I was born into a certain kind of a human body. Not just a body, but a set of expectations and roles that society projects and that society attaches to certain bodies. So because I was born as a woman, something happened. And what is that thing that has happened? Not out of the poet's volition, but because of the accident of fate that she was born a woman. She feels that because she's born a woman, the propinquity of a person. Who is this person? Someone who's addressed as you. Your propinquity, that is the closeness, the proximity. The proximity of a person automatically compels the poet to find that person to be of a good and a high quality, to find your person fair. That is, you may not be fair, is what the poet is saying, but because I am a woman, the very fact that you are physically close to me means that I am compelled to consider your person fair. Right? So, and why is that? This is because in late 19th and early 20th centuries in America, because women were expected to be dependent on men, and because women were expected to be grateful to the attentions given to them by men, and because women ultimately needed the financial or economic and social support of a male relative, such as a husband or in the absence of a husband, other male relatives, they were expected to be grateful to and hold on to the kind of attention they got from other men. And since the poet is a young woman, the only way for a young woman in this time to gain comfort, material comfort in life, was to secure a man or a husband who was himself materially, financially stable and comfortable. The very fact that a person has showered attention on her, the very fact that a person has put himself in close proximity to her, is enough for the poet to feel that he must be a good person. So the poet is saying that you may not be good, and I am not in control of my decisions. But because I'm born a certain way, the very fact that you have chosen to come close to me means that I'm compelled to find you to be of a favorable nature. So far, so good. This is the problem. This is the beginning of a problem. And then what does the poet say? The poet says that I feel a certain zest to bear a body's weight upon my breast. That is, I may not be truly convinced that you are good for me, but because I am a woman, I cannot but make a truly open choice. Right? And then the poet says what? So subtly is the fume of life designed to clarify the pulse and cloud the mind, and leave me once again undone, possessed. That is, there is something about the way society treats different bodies, the bodies of men and women, that determines how our relationship will be played out. And there's something about those societal expectations which mean that the pulse is clarified, the mind is clouded, right? That when men and women are in physical proximity, they think through a kind of biological impulse and not through a rational, logical way of thinking. Society is to blame because women are expected to choose romantic partners or make the choice of a life partner, such as a romantic partner or a husband, by testing their emotions, by testing how their pulse, that is their heart rate, literally the heart rate. The pulse here is a word that describes emotions. Because society treats women as sentimental or romantic creatures, it expects women to make the choice of the ideal partner, that is husband or romantic partner, by thinking about how their pulse quickens, and not by making a logical or rational calculation of what is good for me or who will make a truly good partner. So because of all of these reasons, the poet says that she is not in a very good place, or rather, she is going through certain experiences, but she notices that she is not fully in control of these experiences. And she says that leave me once again undone, possessed. That is, I am undone and I am possessed. I am not the one who is possessing, I am possessed by someone else, by something else. So this is the problem. How to get agency in a world, in a social setting, where women are expected to be weak, sentimental, and at the mercy of, and to be dependent on, and to gain legitimacy, support, and strength from their male partners. In such a world, how can a woman who is independent in her thought and capable of making decisions, capable of logical, rational calculation, how can such a woman hold on to and maintain her ability to choose, her ability to live independently, right? That is the problem. Further, the problem also exists because the poet is not just describing these bodily experiences in a theoretical manner. The poet is also aware that there is some value to the way these two bodies interact with each other. The poet also is convinced that the pulse, when it quickens, it signifies something real. But should the quickening of the pulse be subordinated to how the mind works? No. Both of them, the quickening pulse and the rational mind, both of these things have their own value. It is unfair that society encourages women to make decisions based solely on the quickening pulse. So the poet's quest is to find a way to be independent and to think for herself, to make choices that will be truly good for her, while at the same time acknowledging that the quickening pulse is important. Now, how does the poet change then? How does the poet offer a different perspective on this stated proposition or state of affairs? The ninth line begins thus: "Think not for this, however, the poor treason of my stout blood against my staggering brain. I shall remember you with love, or season my scorn with pity. Let me make it plain." The poet says that all of this is true, meaning I am born into a certain kind of body and I am trained by the culture around me to be disposed towards certain decisions, to be inclined towards certain ways of thinking, right? Which is to say, because I'm born a woman, I'm bound to be sentimental. I'm bound to be too emotional. I'm bound to base my decisions on my emotions and not logic. These are tendencies. These are powerful tendencies, and they affect me very strongly. It is difficult for me to resist these very strong tendencies. And yet the poet writes, "Think not for this, however, the poor treason of my stout blood against my staggering brain." Again, the distinction between body and mind. Just like in the octave, we had a distinction between the pulse and the mind. Here we have distinction between the blood and the brain. Here, in the octave, the poet had stated that society, the fume of life is designed. The way society works is that they encourage women to prioritize the quickening pulse and not the mind. That is, society encourages women to cloud their minds. Society makes women too sentimental. In the sestet, however, the poet states the very opposite. The poet says that my blood, that is my stout blood, creates a treason against my staggering brain. Right? Even though this happens, I'm going to resist it. The poet says that my stout blood will stage a treason against my staggering brain, but that treason will not have much value. Right? The poet says that think not of that poor treason. Right? Think not. Do not worry about that. That treason does not apply in my case. Right? And then the poet says, even though this treason occurs, do not think that I shall remember you with love or season my scorn with pity. Right? So the poet says, the treason of my blood against my brain occurs, but even though that treason occurs, I shall not remember you with love, or that I will not season my scorn with pity. That is, I will scorn you without pity. I will not remember you with love. Right? I'm not affected by this treason of my stout blood against my staggering brain. And then the poet says, let me make it plain. I find this frenzy insufficient reason for conversation when we meet again. Right? So these last two lines, the couplet that ends this sonnet, comes very close to becoming a Shakespearean sonnet, because these two lines signify a dramatic reversal, a very powerful and momentous decision being taken by the poet, and a very important announcement being made by the poet that there is an end to the relationship that the poet has been tracking from the very first line. However, the rhyme scheme and the overall progression of thought in the sonnet makes it clear that these two lines are not best taken as a couplet, but rather as part of the sestet, which is staging a restatement of the problem. And what is the restatement of the problem exactly? The poet's response is that the societal expectations from women exert a very strong pressure on her. But through the power of thinking, through the strength of articulation that she has given herself, the way the poet has found ways of writing and thinking about her situation, all of that comes together to give her a great deal of strength. She finds this frenzy insufficient reason for conversation when we meet again. Right? The poet's ultimate point is that she has found a way to transcend the expectations that society has and attaches to particular sorts of bodies. At this point, we have reached an end of our discussion of Edna St. Vincent Millay's poetry. I hope that this has been a useful introduction to the work of a very important and prolific poet. And we will return by making brief references to the life and work of Edna St. Vincent Millay in subsequent lectures in this course, as and when the occasion presents itself, and as and when the content of our lectures deems it appropriate. Now, we will shift gears now, change tracks a little bit, and talk about another very important poet. In fact, this poet, Thomas Stearns Eliot, is as different as possible from Edna St. Vincent Millay. If Millay's work was popular, accessible, could be read and enjoyed by common readers without reference to complex literary history, without reference to esoteric philosophical ideas, if one could enjoy the words on the page that Millay had written without any footnotes or any academic framing or any sort of explanation given by an expert, right? The very opposite is true about T.S. Eliot, which is to say, T.S. Eliot is the epitome of difficulty in English poetry. Generations upon generations of students have gone through their academic study, whether it is programs of bachelor's or master's, studying English honors, all over the world, struggling with the difficulty of some of the writings of T.S. Eliot's, especially writings in verse. So, Eliot was a poet for whom being difficult or being less than accessible to readers was a virtue. It made poetry better if it was less than accessible. Okay? We will encounter some of that difficulty, but not all of it, because the poems that I have chosen for study in this course do not exactly fit that bill. Let me explain. The poem that is considered to be the most notoriously difficult, both in the modernist canon, both in the literary history of 20th century poetry, and in Eliot's own personal and professional career as a poet, is the long poem titled The Waste Land. That poem is such an icon of 20th century poetry that it can be found quoted and studied as well as written about in a million sources. The same is not true for a later poem that Eliot wrote, which is the Four Quartets. We will focus on this collection of poems titled Four Quartets in this course, and I will begin a detailed reading and analysis of the four quartets in the next lecture. In this lecture, and what remains of it, I will provide a biographical and contextual introduction to the life and work of T.S. Eliot. Now, because the goal of this module is to focus on the four quartets poems, I will begin with a story of a church in England, and it will become clear the relevance of why I'm beginning with the story as we read the four quartets in the next lectures. This church is St. Michael's Parish Church. It is in the county of Somerset in England, and the area is East Coker. This is a very important church for the poet T.S. Eliot because it is in this church that one can find written on a memorial the words Thomas Stearns Eliot, poet. The poet T.S. Eliot chose to have his remains, that is, after he died, his remains were placed in this church. This is a very strange fact. It's a very curious choice that the poet could have made because there was very little connection, physical or tangible connection between the poet and this place that the poet experienced in his lifetime. Nonetheless, there was a deep spiritual connection that the poet felt with this place. I will explain briefly. T.S. Eliot was born in the year 1888 in the city of St. Louis in the southern U.S. state of Missouri. This was on the banks of the Mississippi River, and the date 1888 makes it very clear that this was late 19th century America. Eliot was born to very, very wealthy, business-owning, very, very richly cultured white couple. Eliot's ancestors had made their home in America. Specifically, they were part of the first generation of pilgrims who had migrated from England following persecution by Catholics as well as the Church of England. And as these Puritan pilgrims, they had made their way to the shores of America, settling in New England, and eventually in search of greener pastures, in search of prosperity, business opportunities, and livelihood, at some point the Eliots had made another base in addition to their New England home in this southern American state of Missouri, specifically in the city of St. Louis. So the difference or the distance between St. Louis, Missouri and East Coker or St. Michael's Parish Church is key. It is the distance that tells us a great deal about the life of this poet, how he lived, as well as the work of this poet, what he wrote about, what were the intellectual, spiritual, and emotional energies that animated the work of this poet. It also begs a question, why did Eliot choose to have his mortal remains placed in this church in East Coker? It is as far from the southern US as one can imagine. From semi-rural, a suburban city of St. Louis in the deep south of the US, a city that is characterized by Confederate festivals, sweetened lemonade, and all Southern traditions, with bright sunshine, as the American South is known to have. In contrast to these associations that St. Louis, Missouri has, the area of Somerset is a remote, rural church district with barely any people, very difficult to find, and almost impossible to locate. So the poet was making a very informed and very deliberate decision. The poet was trying to ensure that subsequent generations would recognize a particular genealogy, right? That even though T.S. Eliot was born in St. Louis, Missouri, it was this church in rural England that he called his home. Now, the scholar John Seroz Cooper labels this gesture a self-defining fiction. We will understand more about the self-defining fiction, why T.S. Eliot made this choice, and we will also reflect on how this choice determines what we can say about his very, very powerful and accomplished and masterpiece of a poetic work, that is the Four Quartets. We will continue this discussion in the subsequent lectures. Thank you.